My name is Major Monica Urias. I currently work at the Pentagon. I'm going to go over my ethical dilemma that my commander had and apply the LOD model to the decisions that he made for this ethical dilemma. So the ethical dilemma posed in my interview was by Mr. S, and whether or not he should fight to keep a lackluster officer who had just moved into his office, getting away from a situation of a toxic leader. He found out that she was going through a medical board that she claimed was fraudulent. So the officer was under a toxic leader and had frequent bouts of crying at work because of this person. One day, at the end of her rope, she decided to shout back at her superior, the civilian, and he then used that situation to file paperwork that she was unfit for the Air Force and involuntarily committed her to mental health, to a hospital. So this triggered a medical board for her dismissal. At the time, all of the approvals went up to the Secretary of the Air Force, and the officer was not really a rock star like you hear. They were more lackluster. However, they did their job and they weren't problematic. She had been reprimanded in the past by a 1-star for fraternization several years prior. And at this point, that 1-star was now a 4-star who was actually her commander at ACC. So Mr. S had a few possible solutions. He could retain the mediocre officer, fight the fraudulent paperwork that her previous commander or her previous supervisor had put in, which would require a SecF signature and buy-in from the ACC commander, which had previously reprimanded her, or he could let the med board proceed, and she would likely be dismissed because of the paper trail that her supervisor had kept. So those were his options. For Mr. S, when I asked him, what were the deciding factors? Why did he choose? For him, the greatest values of the profession arms that were at play were integrity, duty, and honor. He felt that it was his duty to stop the fraudulent medical board because of his integrity and honor. And regardless of whether she was not the best officer, she was still put in a situation that was fraudulent, and that lacked integrity, and so he needed to act. During this time, with the officer's permission, of course, he started to gather information, created a paper trail, and did gather the approval of the ACC commander. He felt that this was a case of injustice, and regardless of the past work, the officer should not be treated this way. And more than that, she hadn't done anything to that level that, deemed her unfit to be separated. Not every officer is going to be the best officer. Not everybody's going to be in the top third. And sometimes you have officers who just do their jobs and are perfectly fine. As I stated before, she was not problematic. So he decided to go ahead and try to retain her. So he did put up a formal package with a signature of the ACC commander, so that when the Secretary of the Air Force read the package, she would also read this portion and hopefully decide to retain the officer. The SecF did eventually sign the paperwork, and she signed it in error. I guess typically whenever these packages go up, it's just a few sheets, and the secretary at the time did not flip the page to the ACC commander's recommendations to retain her, and she was actually dismissed. Mr. S had felt that this was an error, and they actually staffed it back up and reached out, and the secretary did say that that was her fault. She didn't see the second page of the package, and she decided on behalf of the ACC's recommendation to retain the officer. So based off of the conversation and Mr. S's decision, I believe that he most clearly demonstrated deontology. So he felt that regardless of the consequence, the medical board was fraudulent, and it was not based on inherent rightness, and regardless of how she had acted or other things, that if she were to be separated, this wasn't the right way to do it, and this did not warrant that, so he had to act. I don't think that his reasoning differs much from mine. I've been in a similar situation with an airman, the opposite, where the airman was a poor worker, and I let the process run its course. It wasn't a fraudulent, claim, but essentially, we just let her time run out so that she wouldn't be able to be retained. And if she did apply for retainability, then we were going to deny that if she did decide to. I think that depending on that situation, right, sometimes it's more paperwork to do it a certain way. And so, I decided on that situation. But in this situation, I think that I probably would have done something very similar to him. I think that what was most important from the interview and analysis was just how he went through the process to come to the conclusion. I think that first decision was what to do was the hardest part. But because he did his research, he had buy-in from the officer, who wanted to be retained, and got consent from her to gather medical paperwork and other, items needed for that paper trail. And then was able to talk to the commander so that if any obstacles did appear, that he would be able to push through. So in conclusion, I think that while this was his way to solve it, there could be multiple solutions. But I think that for this particular officer, there was a positive solution that was met.